Okay, we're back and we're looking at question 17 and 18 on multiple choice, right? Part one. This one is going to take a little bit longer, or this set of questions, 17 to 21 roughly, because there is a lot going on, and most of it centers around Great Depression and FDR. So just but it's a big topic, right? This is one of these topics you should definitely expect. Okay, it's a high value target. So when you take a look at it, what do you need to know? Well, if you remember, America had this time, this really good time, almost like a golden age, called the Roaring Twenties, and things were going really, really good all throughout the 20s. And then in 1929, the stock market crashed. Now, normally that wouldn't be a big deal. However, the president at the time, Herbert Hoover, was practicing this idea that, like the previous presidents before him, that, well, Americans should be able to kind of take care of their own business, right? In other words, this idea of rugged individualism, government shouldn't step in and help. And so the government was slow to take any action. And because of this, the stock market crash ended up trickling out and hurting um, other aspects of civilization. Specifically, people started losing their jobs. Well, why did they lose jobs? Well, people were getting rich quick in the stock market, and so they were borrowing money in order to buy stocks. And then on top of it, they were since you were expecting to get rich, you were buying a bunch of stuff on credit because, of course, your stocks were going to help pay off, and you were going to have all this money shortly. Well, when that didn't happen, and the stock market crashed, people now had taken out a bunch of credit, and they had borrowed to buy a lot of stuff, and the money that they thought that was going to come in wasn't coming in. And then to make matters worse, people that had money saved in order, to kind of look out for themselves, doing the right thing, they when they went to the banks were closing. And when a bank closed back then and went away or declared bankruptcy, that was it. You lost all your money. And so there were, lots of people that were struggling because they couldn't foresee this. And when they looked to the government for help, the government was not prepared to help. They were not interested in helping because this was not what America did. There was no social safety net during this time. And so you end up having people, losing their homes, losing their jobs, losing their life savings, and just literally wandering the streets of America, with the hope that, things would get better. Now, out west, you had another whammy taking place. You had this thing called the Dust Bowl. So, because we had been growing all of this food for World War One, farmers had gotten used to selling all this extra food to other European countries and to the American government. And, you know, because they were used to selling so much food, they invested a lot in equipment and they overfarmed the land. Well, that really turned out to be unfortunate because they got hit out west with a bad drought. And what a drought is when the land dries up, and so it becomes hard and dusty, and you're not able to plant as much. And then on top of it, machines that were being used were allowing the harvesting of crops much more quickly than they had been done in the past, and therefore the soil was getting damaged. And then the topsoil, or the part that was supposed to kind of stick together, got dried and it got charged. And then you get these high winds, and then you get this huge dust cloud. And when I say huge, I mean, like, these dust storms were so big that you know you would have livestock like cows have their lungs filled with dirt. People were showing up at hospitals with dirt in their lungs and severe, like, asthma like symptoms. I mean, it was just terrible. It was like a nightmare. And on top of it, because now the farmers couldn't sell their food because their land wasn't giving crops, they now were going into economic problems because they couldn't sell crops, and if they couldn't sell crops, they couldn't pay the loans off that they took to buy all this new gas powered equipment, and that in turn put them in jeopardy. And now farmers were losing their farms. So this was like a whole big like snowball effect of different things coming together and colliding at the right time. So you get this letter here, right? March 24th, 1935. So you're well into the Great Depression at this point. And there, this person Grace is talking about, whirlwinds and soil beating mercifully, right? And right there, whirlwinds, soil, that's the Dust Bowl she's describing. So what was one impact of the situation described in the letter? Many families were forced to migrate westward. I'll show you in the next slide what that looked like, that migration. So, which New Deal action attempted to address the causes of this situation? Well, they kind of jump forward here with this question because the New Deal is going to be more or less the solution to a lot of the Great Depression problems. And you have FDR, the new president, right? Because Herbert Hoover is going to lose the presidency as people begin complaining and blaming him for the Great Depression. It really wasn't his fault, but you're the president, you're going to get the blame. So people were ready to stop, believing in Hoover and look for someone that was willing to deal with the problems. And that was this governor from New York named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he gets elected president. And one of the things he does is he comes on the radio, and the radio's new technology back then, right? And he's giving speeches and letting people know, don't worry, don't be afraid. I got a plan. I'm going to try stuff, right? I'm going to try different things. I'm going to get relief. I'm going to get recovery out there. We're going to reform things. So he's trying all these different ideas. And one of the ideas that he comes up with is this Civilian Conservation Corps, and it implemented reforestation projects. Well, if you think about it, reforestation is planting, right? But planting not to be harvested like crops immediately, but to plant so that the ground can stay in place. And that would then kind of fix this issue here, right? Because this was really what they call an ecological disaster. It was one of the largest ecological disasters in the United States. So you take a look here, right? This is where this Dust Bowl was taking place, right? So if you look at that Dust Bowl, this is taking place all along here, and it's wild because you could see the dust storms all the way in New York. Like the clouds were so big, so thick, so much soil was kicked up that all the way here in New York, where we're from, like you could see these dust storms. It was wild, right? I mean, for those of you that would have dealt with the orange sky, right, when the forests, the maple trees were burning in Canada, and they had their forest fires, right? It was something similar to that, where you say, "Whoa, there's forest fires in Canada, and we're seeing them here all the way in New York. We're seeing them across the country. There's orange skies. What's going on?" Those are huge ecological disasters, right? So, what are these New Deal, right? Which New Deal action attempted to address the causes of this situation, right? So, um, the question here, right, of the situation, well, we know what the situation is. It's the Dust Bowl, and that was question 18. But when we look deeper, well, what are some of the plans, right? You know, these are some of the New Deal programs that were started under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? And again, remember, it was relief, recovery, reform. Some people like to use the term regulation instead of reform. It's okay. It just means that you're trying to like fix or kind of tamp down on any corruption or problems that they know to exist. So relief, right? This would be an example of relief, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Recovery, the National Industrial Recovery Act, right? It's in its name, like recovery. And then Something like reform would be, like fixing the stock market and making sure that the stock market is not gonna, go to a crash again. So there's a lot of different programs that pop up because FDR is pushing to try to make changes. And if you see like 1933, 1933, 33, 33, 35, 34, right? So as soon as he gets elected, he's like at it. Um, the problem, because there's always a problem, is that there's, here you have FDR here. I'll explain this right here. But the problem is that not everyone is going to be on board with what FDR is doing because he's trying a lot of things that we've never seen in the country before. And so people are going to begin to question it, right? If you look at if this political cartoon happens to show up, right, that's the FDR Congress. It's labeled, and you see the stars on the feet, right? By the on the pajamas underneath, right? That's Uncle Sam, and he looks sickly, and here are all the medicines. And so FDR is the doctor in this picture, and all of these are labeled. These are all these three-letter programs, New Deal programs that were created. Well, it's interesting because question 19 here, they do something kind of weird. They're in this FDR time zone, right? Which is the 1930s, but then they bring up something from like the 60s to compare. So they don't do this often where they kind of jump out of order, but every now and then they do. Don't let it get you rattled. Just understand that if they're bringing it up at this time, they probably want you to make some type of comparison. So which later presidential program is most similar to the idea expressed in the passage? So we see this is like, you know, New Deal stuff, understanding, we determined to make every American interest and concern we will never regard, right? So all of this is stuff like changing society type stuff. And in the term, President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, right? I mean, what was the Great Society? It was about making a better life for Americans. And that's the comparison that's being made, right? These are two presidents that both happen to be Democrats trying to make a better life for their fellow Americans, right? This one, President Jimmy Carter's Camp David Accords, this was trying to make peace in the Middle East, right? Ronald Reagan's supply side fiscal policy, this was trying to Ronald Reagan was trying to deal with something called stagflation in the 1980s. He usually doesn't get you know this is usually not seen as a good thing because there was something called trickle down economics that went along with it. In other words, if you provide money to the wealthy, they will eventually help out the rest of society. It didn't kind of work that way. Um, President George W. Bush, War on Terror. Oh, no, that was like the hunt for Osama bin Laden and the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. This is when all of that started. So none of these other three match this idea of, well, this is a interest in the country and concern, right? And both of these programs, right, the New Deal and the Great Society, these are what we call domestic policy, meaning you're dealing with issues within the country, as opposed to foreign policy, which are you're dealing with other countries and with problems, in interactions between the United States and another country. Okay. So what was the problems that it's because it sounds like this FDR guy is amazing, right? And he kind of is amazing. He gets elected 4 times. That's right, 4 times. Unbelievable, right? He broke George Washington's rule of only serving twice, and he went 4 times. And he didn't take power, he was actually legally elected. But one of the problems that FDR comes up with, and this is true for anyone that's in power too long, is that they start to kind of do things that are not um, always considered democratic. So if you look, one of the things that he did was what was called the court packing scheme. He didn't like FDR didn't like the fact that the Supreme Court, like people kept suing FDR saying, you can't do that. You can't, that New Deal program's not legal. You can't spend the government's money that way. And because he kept getting sued, it kept activating the checks and balances, right? Clause. In other words, um, it's the court, whenever there's a lawsuit, the court's checks and balance power comes into play. And they're the ones that can declare things unconstitutional either by the president or laws unconstitutional by Congress. So, but it takes somebody to complain. And of course, there's as many people that love the New Deal. There were people that hated New Deal policies, and so they sued. And Roosevelt's solution to this was, well, if 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 I can't, they keep suing, then why don't I just add more judges, right? So if you look here in 1789, there were 6 justices, five in 1801, and so on and so forth. And from like 1869 to 1937, there were 9 justices. And in fact, there's 9 Supreme Court justices today, right? It hasn't changed. This seems to be like the magic number for us. Well, FDR wanted to make it 15. He wanted to add 6 more justices because he figured, like the political cartoon is showing up here, that you know the more justices he would add to the Supreme Court, they would kind of answer to him. And people were not happy about that. As much as people really loved FDR and they were willing to reelect him, there were just some things that they didn't feel comfortable with. And this kind of felt a little bit you know like a power grab. um and one of the things, right, that the thing is like our country has always been very careful when it comes to the idea that you have someone who might be looking to become a dictator, right? And so that's why we have separation of powers. Oh, let me go back. That's why we have separation of powers, right? You have the executive, the legislative, the judicial, right? Meaning that each of these 3 branches of government have different jobs. And then on top of that, we have some checks and balances, meaning that the branches can kind of check in on each other with certain things, right? The president can veto a law that he thinks, a bill that he thinks is not going to be a good law, right? Congress can override the president with a 2/3 vote. Or if the president's not doing the right thing, Congress can vote to impeach the president, right? The president gets to pick the judges, and then Congress has to decide if that person is worthy for the job. So there's a lot of like checking going on in between the 3 branches, even though each branch has its own power. And so when it came down to the court packing scheme, um, the legislative branch and the judicial branch were not fans, and more importantly, the people were not fans. And so this never this didn't go through, thankfully, right? This was just something that Roosevelt wanted in order to consolidate power, make things better. And so thankfully, Roosevelt never does become a dictator, right? And in fact, he gets us through World War II during these years, almost all the way through. He passes away early in, the last year of the war in 45. Um, but then what happens is that, you know, we kind of, after the war, as the war is coming to a close and, going through, we realize, you know what? There is no guaranteed rule that says someone can't run for power again and again and again. And so what happens is Congress passes the 22nd Amendment, which says, you know, you can only run for 2 terms, right? 2 terms and no more than 10 years total, right? And you say, but hey, how does that happen? How do you get to the 10-year thing? Well, the 10-year thing, I remember 2 terms, by the way, is 4 years each, right? You get elected president, you get 4 years, and then you get 4 years, right? So 2 terms. But you could get technically 10 if you're the vice president and the president you're serving under dies after their second year. You get to finish their other year and how whatever else time is left. So technically, you could serve your 4 and then another 4 and then whatever was left over by the previous president, the other year and 11 months. And so but it can't go over 10 years, right? That's the 22nd Amendment, because we just don't want to believe, I mean, you want to trust people and trust that, yeah, we could have another uh, quote unquote benevolent type of president, if you want to call him that. Remember, he was also responsible for the internment of Japanese Americans, right, during World War II, which was a really bad thing, right? Korematsu versus United States. So, you know, but you don't want to put the trust that this person is going to be, strong enough not to become a dictator. So, in order to avoid that, we have the 22nd Amendment. So, I hope this was helpful to you, and I'll see you in the next one.